It began with a smell so strange, so foreign that it made starving prisoners freeze in confusion. It was sweet, greasy, and warm. It didn't belong in a prison camp. It didn't belong in a war. It smelled like food. The date was May 2, 1945, and the place was Camp McCoy, a sprawling prisoner-of-war facility tucked among the pine forests of Wisconsin. For nearly 3 years, it had housed thousands of German and Italian POWs, soldiers who had once marched through Europe under the banners of men who, by every definition, were the enemy. And yet that day, as the war in Europe crumbled, these same prisoners stood in stunned silence while American guards rolled in wooden carts filled with freshly grilled hamburgers and buckets of Coca-Cola bottles chilled on ice. No one moved at first. Some of the prisoners thought it was a trick, a test of loyalty, or perhaps some cruel joke. Others whispered that it might be a feast before an execution. But then one of the guards, a broad-shouldered sergeant with a friendly grin, waved a spatula in the air and shouted, "Come on, fellas, war's over, let's eat." The prisoners stared. The smoke from the grill curled into the spring air, carrying with it the scent of sizzling beef and onions. For men who had spent years living on thin soup and black bread, the smell alone was intoxicating. Slowly, hesitantly, one German stepped forward, a young man with hollow cheeks and a Red Cross patch sewn into his tattered uniform. The sergeant handed him a paper plate with a hamburger, the bun soft, the meat hot. The German blinked, muttered a word of thanks, and took a bite. The sound that followed wasn't applause or laughter. It was silence, heavy and unreal. For the first time since the war began, enemies were breaking bread together, and it wasn't bread at all. It was a hamburger. That single act would become a legend at Camp McCoy. The day the Americans fed the enemy, not with bitterness or dominance, but with burgers and Coke. The day war's hatred cracked, just a little. But to understand how it came to this, you have to go back to the beginning, to the creation of the camp itself, and to the strange, contradictory world of POW life in America. Camp McCoy was built before the war in 1939 as a training ground for the U.S. Army. When America entered World War II in December 1941, it quickly became one of the largest prisoner-of-war camps in the Midwest. By 1944, more than 8,000 German soldiers lived behind its barbed wire fences. Many were troops captured in North Africa, men who had fought under in the desert sun and were now freezing under Wisconsin snow. For them, captivity was surreal. They expected cruelty. They found boredom. The Geneva Convention, which both Germany and the U.S. had signed, required humane treatment of POWs, and the Americans, proud of their adherence to international law, mostly followed it. Prisoners received food, medical care, and even pay for work. They built roads, harvested crops, chopped firewood, essential labor that replaced American men gone to war. Locals called them the polite Germans. They were forbidden to leave camp, but many worked under light supervision in nearby farms and factories. Some even attended church services or concerts. For the most part, Camp McCoy was peaceful, a strange island of civility in a world at war. But peace did not erase tension. Inside the camp, rival factions formed, the hardened Nazis who still believed in and the weary soldiers who had long stopped believing in anything. The ideological divide sometimes turned violent. Informers were beaten, suspected traitors disappeared. American guards, too, were divided, between those who viewed the prisoners as men deserving respect and those who saw them as monsters who had bombed London, burned villages, and filled concentration camps. Yet as months passed, a kind of uneasy rhythm developed. Guards and prisoners began to understand each other, not through words, but through routine, a nod at roll call, a shared cigarette, a moment of recognition that, stripped of uniforms, they were simply men far from home. Then came April 1945. News of suicide reached Camp McCoy on May 1st. The announcement came over the camp loudspeakers, and for a moment, time stopped. In the barracks, whispers rippled like wind through tall grass. Some refused to believe it. Others sat in stunned silence, staring at the floor. That night, one of the guards, Sergeant Bill, remembered seeing something strange. "They didn't cheer," he said later. "They didn't mourn, they just stopped, like their world had ended and they didn't know what to build in its place." By morning, the war in Europe was all but over. Germany's surrender was imminent. The prisoners were no longer enemies, not officially at least. And that's when Camp McCoy's commander, Colonel Harold Potter, made a decision that baffled nearly everyone under his command. He ordered a celebration. A victory cookout, he called it, not just for the American guards, but for the prisoners, too. The mess sergeant thought it was a joke. "Sir, you mean feed the Krauts hamburgers and Coca-Cola?" "Yes," Potter replied simply, "feed them." When word spread, some guards protested. "Sir, these men were shooting at us last year," one corporal shouted. Potter's answer was cold but measured. "The war's done. Our job was to beat them. We did. Now we show them what decency looks like." So on May 2, under a bright Wisconsin sky, the grills were lit. American cooks, many of them farm boys from the Midwest, lined up griddles and iron pans. Beef patties sizzled, onions caramelized, Coca-Cola bottles clinked in tubs of ice. Loudspeakers played Miller. Across the yard, behind the barbed wire, German prisoners gathered by the hundreds, watching in disbelief. When the gates opened and the guards beckoned them forward, there was hesitation, then movement. Step by step, they approached the smell of food. Some smiled nervously, others muttered prayers. One man removed his cap as though stepping into a church. And then the first hamburger changed hands. It was greasy, imperfect, and utterly human. By evening, the camp was filled with laughter, hesitant at first, then genuine. Guards and prisoners sat on opposite sides of the same tables. Coca-Cola fizzed. A few men tried to toast with glass bottles. One American private asked a German soldier, "So, what'll you do when you get home?" The German shrugged. "If I have a home," he said softly, "maybe I start again." They sat in silence for a moment. Two soldiers, one victory, one defeat, both unsure what peace even meant. Later that night, Colonel Potter wrote in his diary, "Today, for the first time, I saw the war truly end. Not in Berlin, not in Washington, but here over hamburgers." That day would be remembered by those who were there as the moment the myth of the enemy cracked. Because in that smoky yard in Wisconsin, the soldiers of two nations discovered something the war had nearly erased. That humanity, buried under uniforms and propaganda, still existed. And for the prisoners of Camp McCoy, men who had once believed they were fighting for a 1,000-year empire, that hamburger tasted like something far older and stronger. It tasted like forgiveness. The next morning at Camp McCoy smelled faintly of ashes and onions. The cookout was over, but the memory of it hung in the air and not just in scent. Something fundamental had changed, though no one could quite describe it. The prisoners moved more slowly that day. Some looked dazed, as though waking from a long dream. The guards, too, carried a strange quiet with them, the kind that follows an event no one expected but everyone somehow needed. To the men on both sides of the barbed wire, the hamburger day, as it would come to be called, had been more than a meal. It had been a moment when war's machinery, built on fear and propaganda, had faltered. That night, Sergeant Bill sat outside the guard barracks, his rifle across his knees, a half-smoked cigarette between his fingers. The sun was setting, burning the Wisconsin sky into gold. Beside him sat Private Jack, the youngest in the unit, barely 20. Exhaled smoke. "Never thought I'd see the day I'd flip burgers for a bunch of Krauts." Gave a short laugh. "Yeah, well, they looked human yesterday, didn't they?" Frowned. "You saying they weren't before?" Didn't answer immediately. He flicked ash off his cigarette and watched it scatter. "All I'm saying, kid, is war makes you forget that part we all forgot on both sides." Inside the wire, the Germans were wrestling with their own disbelief. In barrack number 14, a group of former soldiers sat at a rough wooden table, talking in low voices. One of them, a gaunt man named, had been in captivity since 1943. He was one of the senior NCOs, respected for his discipline and his quiet dignity. "They must be mocking us," muttered a younger prisoner, still clinging to bitterness. "You saw how they laughed while we ate." "No," replied calmly. "They weren't laughing at us. They were laughing because they could, because they were free to." Scowled, "And we are not." Looked down at his hands and rough. "Not yet. But yesterday I tasted something I haven't known in years, decency." He paused, choosing his words. If a man can give food to his enemy, maybe the world isn't lost. The barrack fell silent. Outside, the sound of an American truck starting echoed across the camp, and somewhere, faintly, someone was whistling a tune, "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree." For the first time in years, the prisoners allowed themselves to feel something close to peace. Word of the strange feast spread quickly through the American military network. Letters home carried fragments of it, guards writing to wives or mothers, trying to explain how they had fed the enemy. One such letter, written by Sergeant, survives today in a museum archive. "Ma, yesterday we threw a cookout for the Germans. Real hamburgers, Coca-Cola, everything. I thought I'd hate it, but when I saw them eat, it did something to me. They looked like boys from Kansas or Iowa, thin, scared, just done with it all. I don't know if it makes me soft, but it felt right. Maybe this is what victory's supposed to feel like, not shouting, not killing, but letting it go." Back in town, news of the event reached the locals, too. Some reacted with surprise, even anger. In nearby Sparta, Wisconsin, a grocer named Henry grumbled to his customers. "We got ration books for sugar and meat, and they're grilling steaks for Nazis." Others saw it differently. Reverend, a local pastor, wrote in his church bulletin, "If our boys can feed their enemies, then maybe peace is possible after all." The world outside Camp McCoy didn't know it yet, but across the United States, small acts like these, spontaneous, quiet, deeply human, were beginning to close the wound of war. For the prisoners, life began to shift in subtle ways. Where once the guards barked orders, they now spoke with a measure of civility. Some of the Americans even tried a few German phrases. The prisoners responded in halting English. Words like please and thank you began to cross the language barrier. One of the camp interpreters, Private Edward, himself the son of German immigrants, became a bridge between them. He recalled later, "After the cookout, everything felt different. They weren't just numbers anymore. They'd ask me about baseball, about the radio shows, about jazz. And some of them, they'd hum along to Miller like they knew it by heart." The strange thing noted was that many of these prisoners, especially those captured in Africa or Italy, had never been true Nazis. They were soldiers of circumstance, fighting because their country demanded it, not because they believed in it. One of them, a 19-year-old named, told him one day while hoeing the camp's garden, "I was in school when the war began. They told us we were saving Europe. But when I saw the desert in Africa and men dying for sand, I stopped believing." Asked him what he thought now. Smiled weakly. "Now, I just want to go home and plant potatoes." By mid-May, official word came from Europe. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. The guards assembled the prisoners in formation. The American flag rippled in the breeze above the camp, and the voice of the commanding officer echoed across the yard. "Your war has ended. You are now under the protection of the United States Army until your return to your homeland." Some of the prisoners saluted instinctively, not to the flag but to the concept of order, of finality. Others wept quietly. For men who had been trained never to show weakness, the emotion was startling. But the end of the war was not the end of their captivity. They would remain in the United States for months, some for years, as repatriation slowly unfolded. Still, the change was immediate. The barbed wire felt less like a prison, more like a boundary waiting to be opened. The guards began allowing limited recreation, soccer matches, woodworking, even small concerts. The camp orchestra, composed entirely of German prisoners, played, and for an audience of both Americans and POWs. One evening, as the sun set behind the pine trees, the orchestra performed Ode to Joy. Sergeant stood at the back of the crowd, arms crossed, listening. The melody rose, pure and defiant, echoing through the. Private whispered, "Sounds strange hearing that here." Nodded, "Maybe not so strange. Maybe it's the right place." He didn't say it, but both men understood. The music wasn't German anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd survived. As summer rolled in, a sense of uneasy friendship developed between the captors and the captured. Some guards taught the prisoners how to play baseball. In return, the Germans taught them card games and songs. Lies and propaganda, once walls between them, began to crumble under small gestures. One prisoner, a former baker from Cologne named Otto Weber, started baking bread in the camp kitchen. The Americans loved it so much that they brought him real flour and yeast from town. Soon, the smell of fresh bread wafted through the camp each morning. A rumor spread that Otto had once baked for a Luftwaffe general. "Guess now he's baking for the Yankees," a guard joked. Otto laughed, wiping flour from his hands. "Bread doesn't care who eats it," he said simply. That became an unspoken motto of Camp McCoy. But outside the camp, Not everyone approved of this compassion. Letters began arriving from families who had lost sons in Europe. One widow wrote to the base commander, "My boy died in Bostonia. I can't understand how you can feed the men who killed him hamburgers and Coca-Cola. Do you think that's justice?" Colonel Potter never replied publicly, but those close to him remembered his words that evening. Justice wins wars, mercy ends them. He believed what had happened at Camp McCoy mattered, not because it erased pain, but because it showed the world what America stood for when the shooting stopped. Still, there were hard days ahead. Repatriation was slow, prisoners grew restless, guards grew tired, but the tone had changed forever. In time, the hamburgers and the Coke became legend, retold by soldiers and prisoners alike, embellished with every telling. Some said it had been hundreds of burgers, others thousands. Some claimed a general attended, others that a German officer gave a speech. The truth, as always, was simpler. It had been ordinary men doing something extraordinary, choosing humanity over hate. And as the summer sun set behind the pines, the myth of the enemy, the unbridgeable gap between us and them, began to fade into memory. But for the men of Camp McCoy, both the guards and the prisoners, the question still lingered quietly in the dusk. If we can share a meal, can we ever share a world? The war in Europe had been over for weeks, but inside the barbed wire of Camp McCoy, time moved strangely. The prisoners knew they were no longer enemies, yet they were not free. The guards knew the war was won, yet victory didn't feel like they had imagined. There was no cheering crowd here, no ticker-tape parade, only the quiet rhythm of men who had survived, each trying to make sense of what was left. In early June 1945, a rumor spread through the camp that some prisoners would soon be shipped home. It wasn't true, not yet, but the hope alone changed everything. Work crews started singing again. Prisoners repaired fences, swept walkways, planted flowers near their barracks. It wasn't duty anymore. It was a way to prepare for life after barbed wire. For some, like the senior NCO who'd once commanded a machine gun section in North Africa, that hope was painful. One evening, he stood near the fence watching the Wisconsin sunset bleed into the horizon. Behind him, the laughter of guards drifted from the mess hall. He thought of his wife back in Bremen, of the letter he hadn't received in 2 years. He didn't know if she was alive. He didn't know if his home still stood. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Beautiful evening, eh?" It was Sergeant, the American guard who had helped organize the cookout. Nodded, "Yes, it reminds me of the fields outside Hanover, except quieter." Leaned against the fence. "Too quiet for my liking, can't get used to peace." Studied him for a moment. "Peace is harder than war, Sergeant. In war, a man knows what he must do. In peace, he must decide who he is." It was the kind of statement that might have sounded philosophical in another place. Here, it felt like confession. The two men stood in silence for a while, then asked, "You got family back home?" "A wife," said softly, "and a son. He would be 6 now." Hesitated, "You'll see them soon." Gave a thin smile, "Maybe, if the war didn't take them." He turned to leave, but before he did, he added quietly, "Thank you for the hamburger." Blinked, "You remember that?" Nodded, "I think about it often. I fought Americans in Tunisia. I shot at them. They shot at me. But that day," he paused, searching for the words. "That day, for a moment, I was not a soldier. I was just a man." Then he walked away. By midsummer, the camp had changed. The prisoners built furniture for local schools, harvested crops for nearby farms, and even performed music for townsfolk. The hostility that once surrounded Camp McCoy had started to fade. Still, there were reminders of the world outside. Every week, the camp newspaper printed updates on Europe, the Nuremberg trials, the bombings in Japan, the discovery of concentration camps. Those stories hit like cold water. Some of the prisoners couldn't read them without trembling. They had claimed they didn't know about the atrocities committed by there, but now there was no denying it. In one barrack, a group of older soldiers argued heatedly over the reports. "It's Allied propaganda," one insisted. "They lie to make us look like monsters." Slammed his fist on the table. "Stop lying to yourself." The room went silent. He continued, voice shaking. "We wore the same uniform. Maybe we didn't do it, but it was done in our name. And if we don't admit that, then what did we fight for?" No one spoke after that, but from that day on, the laughter in that barrack was quieter. One afternoon, Private, the bilingual guard, was assigned to escort a group of German prisoners to work on a nearby farm. As they rode in the back of a truck, passing through the rolling green Wisconsin countryside, one of the prisoners, a thin young man named, turned to him. He said hesitantly, "In Germany, they told us America was chaos, that your people were weak, that we would conquer you in months." He gave a small, bitter laugh. "And yet here I am alive because your army fed me." Smiled faintly. "Don't believe everything governments tell you." Looked out the window. "No, not anymore." The truck rattled on down the dusty road. For the first time in years, found himself thinking about the future, not the fatherland, but simple things. The smell of bread, the feel of soil, the possibility of peace. When they reached the farm, the prisoners unloaded crates while the farmer, a stout man in overalls, stood by with folded arms. He'd lost a son in the war, and he made no attempt to hide his resentment. As lifted a sack of grain, the farmer's wife came out of the house with a pitcher of water. She hesitated for a long moment, then handed it to him. Froze, the farmer stared at her. She just said, "He looks thirsty." He drank the water slowly, then handed the pitcher back with trembling hands. He whispered. It was a small moment, but for it meant more than the hamburger ever had. That summer, several prisoners were granted permission to work outside the camp regularly. They helped rebuild barns, mend fences, and harvest wheat. The farmers paid them in kind, fresh milk, vegetables, sometimes cigarettes. And then something even stranger began to happen, friendships. A few guards started visiting local families with small gifts made by prisoners, wooden toys, hand-carved boxes, little things crafted during their free time. The townspeople, once wary, began to soften. A local newspaper printed a headline, "ENMIS no longer. German PRISONERS win HEARTS ATMCCOY." The article told the story of Otto Weber, the baker who had started working in the camp kitchen. It described how his bread was now being sold in town to raise money for the Red Cross. When Colonel Potter read the piece, he smiled. "Guess that's one war story worth printing," he said. But for all the progress, there were still moments of tension. One day in July, a guard discovered a small swastika carved into a table in one of the barracks. The commander ordered it sanded off immediately. When questioned, no one admitted to carving it, but the mood in the camp darkened for days. Some men still clung to the old faith, unable to imagine a world without the ideology that had ruled them. At roll call, addressed his barrack. "You think this symbol gives you strength? It gives you nothing. The world it promised is gone. We are the proof of that." He looked around at their faces, weary and pale. "The Americans gave us food. They gave us respect. Maybe it's time we start giving something back, if not to them, then to ourselves." That night, someone quietly carved a new symbol over the sanded table, a small cross. By August, the first transports were finally being organized. Some prisoners would be sent to England to assist in rebuilding bombed cities before returning home. Others, especially those with trade skills, would stay in the U.S. until early 1946. When's name appeared on the repatriation list, he stood staring at it for a long time. Around him, men cheered, hugged, shouted with relief, but he felt only a heavy calm. He packed his few belongings carefully, a small wooden carving of a bird, a Red Cross Bible, and a folded piece of paper. Sergeant's letter, which he'd been given as a farewell gift. Found him later by the gate. "Guess this is it," the sergeant said. Extended his hand. "I won't forget what you did here." "Wasn't just me," replied. "We all needed that day." They shook hands firmly. Two soldiers, enemies once, equals now. As walked toward the waiting truck, called out, "Hey, when you get home, try a Coke for me." Laughed for the first time in months. "Only if you promise to try German beer." The truck drove away, dust trailing behind it, sunlight glinting off its metal sides. And just like that, the men who had once fought to destroy each other parted as something new, witnesses to the same truth. That even in the ruins of war, decency could grow. That night, as the camp quieted, Private sat beside the fence, writing in his journal. "We spent the evening talking about hamburgers. Funny how something so small became a legend. But maybe it wasn't about the food. Maybe it was about remembering that even in war, we can still be people. Maybe that's what makes us different from what we fight." He closed his notebook, listening to the crickets outside, and for the first time, the fence didn't look like a line dividing men. It looked like a line waiting to disappear. By the time the first snow fell over Camp McCoy again, the war was a memory, but not one anyone could easily escape. The fences still stood, though fewer men waited behind them now. Most of the German prisoners had been sent home or transferred to work camps in Europe. Those who remained spent their final months living in an odd, suspended world, no longer prisoners, but not yet free men. Outside the wire, America was already changing. Ration books had vanished, soldiers were returning from the Pacific, and victory posters were fatting on store windows. But for the guards and prisoners of Camp McCoy, the war's ending didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a long exhale that never quite finished. Sergeant Bill stood near the front gate one morning, watching a convoy of trucks preparing to leave. The men inside, former enemies, waved as they rolled out toward the rail station. Some even shouted words of thanks in broken English. "Goodbye, Sergeant. Good luck." Raised a hand, half in salute, half in farewell. He never thought he'd feel pride watching Germans drive away, but he did. Pride that somehow in this quiet corner of Wisconsin, the war had ended the right way. A few weeks later, the camp chaplain organized a final service, not for victory, but for memory. The makeshift chapel, a converted mess hall, was crowded with guards and the last remaining prisoners. On the front table sat two flags, one American, one German, both folded, both equal in size. The chaplain, Reverend, spoke simply. "We have seen the best and worst of men, but even the worst can change. The fences around us may fall, but what we build next, what we carry inside us, will decide what kind of peace this becomes." He paused, then added quietly, "Yesterday enemies, tomorrow neighbors." When the service ended, no one clapped. No one spoke. They just stood together, listening to the faint hum of wind through the pines. As winter deepened, Private found himself spending more time in the camp library, a small wooden building filled with donated books, many of them from local families. One afternoon, as he sorted through returned volumes, he found a note tucked inside a copy of The Grapes of Wrath. It was written in careful, formal English. "To the men who guarded me with fairness, I say thank you. I have seen your country, and it has changed what I believe a nation can be. I will tell my son about this place, not as a prison, but as proof that mercy can win where war has failed. FM, Barrack 14. Folded the note and kept it in his wallet for the rest of his life. Not all memories of Camp McCoy were so kind. Some guards went home to towns where people couldn't understand what they'd done. Private's father, a veteran of World War I, asked him, "You really shared food with those men? After what they did?" Tried to explain, "They were just people, Dad, they were done fighting." His father shook his head, "You're soft." Maybe he was, but didn't care. He wrote later in his diary, "I used to think strength meant killing the enemy. Now I think strength is knowing when not to." In the spring of 1946, the last group of prisoners left Camp McCoy. The trucks rolled out one final time, past the watchtowers, past the wire that would soon be dismantled. The guards stood silently as they left. Among the departing men was the young prisoner who once dreamed of planting potatoes. As his truck idled near the gate, he called out to who was supervising the departure. "Sergeant, when you come to Germany, I buy you a beer." Laughed, "You better make it two." They waved as the truck drove off, disappearing down the road lined with pines. And then it was quiet again. Months later, long after the camp had emptied, a letter arrived at Colonel Potter's office. It was written from Bremen, Germany, in faded blue ink. "Dear Colonel, I have returned home. The city is in ruins, but we live. My wife and son survived. I am working to rebuild what was lost. I want you to know that I have not forgotten Camp McCoy or the meal you gave us. That day taught me something no speech or sermon ever could. That peace is not signed at a table. It is served on a plate. Yours sincerely." Potter read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in his desk drawer. He never replied, but he kept it for the rest of his life. In the years that followed, the story of Camp McCoy, Day of the Enemy Feast, spread quietly through veteran circles. Some thought it was a myth. Others remembered it vividly, the smell of the grill, the disbelief on the prisoners' faces, the strange joy that followed. When newspapers finally wrote about it decades later, they called it the day the enemy ate burgers. Historians debated whether it was spontaneous or planned. Some dismissed it as sentimental nonsense. but those who had been there never forgot. For them, it wasn't about hamburgers or Coca-Cola. It was about what those things represented, a moment when men stopped being enemies and started being human again. Years later, in 1962, an American tourist visiting Bremen stopped at a small near the river Weser. The owner, a graying man with kind eyes, brought him a cup of coffee. The two began to talk. The American mentioned he was from Wisconsin. The owner smiled slowly. "Wisconsin," he said in accented English. "Camp McCoy." The tourist looked up, startled. "You were there?" "Yes," the man said. "I was a prisoner. They fed us hamburgers." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "Can you believe? The enemy fed us hamburgers. It was the best meal I ever had." The American stared at him. "Did you ever think about it later?" "Every day," the man replied, "because that was the day I stopped hatting." Back in the States, Camp McCoy continued to operate as an army base. The barracks were rebuilt, the fences replaced, and the memories buried under new history. But every spring, when the scent of grilled food drifted from the mess hall, some old veterans swore they could still feel it, the moment when smoke and mercy mingled in the Wisconsin air. A few of them kept letters, old photos, fragments of that impossible day. To most of the world, it was just a curious footnote in the long, brutal story of World War II. But to those who lived it, it was proof of something enduring. That humanity, once given a chance, can outlive hatred. In the end, the legend of Camp McCoy wasn't about hamburgers or prisoners or victory. It was about what happens when ordinary men, worn down by war, decide to act like something more than soldiers. It was about a colonel who chose mercy over vengeance. About a sergeant who shared food instead of fear. About prisoners who learned that dignity could exist even behind wire. And about a single meal that made strangers see each other as men again. Because history remembers battles and generals, treaties and dates. But sometimes what truly changes the world is smaller, quieter, and infinitely more human. A hamburger. A Coke. A moment of grace in a world that had forgotten what it meant.